Russia's offensive in the Bakhmut region continues, but what is going on in the Luhansk province? Is it still really the site of a Russian advance? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's February 6th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first off, when we look at the control map, we can see that there are a couple of key differences. First is Russian forces making advances block by block through, not sure what that was all about, making advances block by block through eastern Bakhmut. You guys can see that it looks like they've advanced by one city block. That is a glacial rate of progress for urban warfare, but actually much more typical. You can also see that they have been pushed out from Optine or never really held this area in the first place. When we look to the north somewhat, you guys can see that there's this bubble outside of Blahodotne. I think they're trying to further surround Krasnohora, but in the process have just taken a bunch of empty fields. And this is, again, pretty typical of what we've seen of Russian handiwork so far. And you can see, continuing their policy of seizing empty fields, they've seized some outside of Mykolaiivka. Now, this is, of course, interesting for a couple of reasons. Again, this looks like Ukrainian armed forces making the Russians pay for very slow progress in Bakhmut, but progress nonetheless. But I think it's more significant that Russia's continuing its strange sort of efforts where its attacks just simply don't align with strategic value. I can kind of see Krasnohora has become a stubborn holdout for Russian forces. And this entire cluster, honestly, they probably have realized they do need to surround it and cut it off. You guys can see there's a very robust exit strategy right here in the form of this roadway. That is Ukrainian controlled. So as long as Ukraine can keep these corridors open, this area is going to remain intact, though I suspect that, again, Ukrainian forces are going to probably have to make some tough calls at some point in the future. But right now, Russia just continues to just take whatever territory is available. It's like they just want to show gains, which I actually suspect is the case. There is a new Russian minister of defense that was appointed a couple of weeks ago. He's not exactly known as a tactical genius, but he is a very savvy political actor. And I believe he's going to want to be able to brief his bosses that progress is happening. And so to do that, of course, you have to take progress where you can get it. That's probably why we're seeing, again, all over the front lines, all these weird bulges that, as we've talked about, usually you don't want to allow to persist. You usually want to do like what they did here outside of Ivansky and Chasiv Yar, right? They created this big point out here, and then they brought up the remainder of the lines. You can see here, created this big salient, and then they brought up the remaining lines so that it wasn't quite so jutted out. And I think that's just good positional warfare, right? These salients can become dangerous, especially here. I mean, imagine being these troops. You're surrounded by Ukrainians on three sides. You are in a big open field. Ukrainians are in developed urban areas. This is just bad. This is just you have to either continue your advance or retreat. It's not clear that Ukrainians are counterattacking. I think they have even publicly said that they expect a Russian offensive in the near future, probably towards the end of this month, which of course would align with the other leaked intel that Putin is rumored to have ordered the Russian military to seize the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts by the end of March. So unless it would require something of a lightning offensive to achieve those goals by a March timetable, even if you start your offensive in like February. So Possible, very possible. When we look at the ground combat situation, you can see things have taken an interesting direction. First, you can see that there are attacks listed exactly where you would predict them. Krasnohora, right, north of Soledar, Ivansky, and of course here in eastern Bakhmut. This control map is somewhat less updated. But in the south, right outside Donetsk city, you could see that the level of offensive operations is tremendous. And also interesting that it doesn't sound like there's reported gains, but I see something like this and I think that there's almost no way that there hasn't been some sort of tactical change that we'll probably hear about tomorrow. So again, this is probably, I suspect, another red herring. There's enough decent data that Russian forces are primarily looking in Luhansk, but it's highly possible that this is part of a coordinated attack. Again, when you have low training forces, you are limited in how you can deploy them in tactical ways, right? These recently mobilized troops, DNR, LNR soldiers, even many, I suspect, of the replacement forces going into Russian active duty units, they're just not at the level required to do complex feints, maneuvers, passages of lines, which passage of lines is when you have a unit that's fighting here and then another unit passes through the lines to conduct an offensive. These are really complex operations that require training down to the individual soldier level, something Russia doesn't have the time to invest in, which means their only options for a lot of these low-skill units are simply attack or don't, on or off, a binary. And so what I suspect may be happening is Russia may be trying to use its disparate forces, right? This is kind of known as the region of the DNR, LNR forces. It may be trying to turn the switch on, simply tell them, hey, we need you to turn all the switches to the on position because we're going to be launching this big attack. That would make sense, right? That they would press Ukraine here, press Ukraine in Bakhmut, and then attempt to press Ukraine in Luhansk. Now, you may notice Luhansk is kind of quiet. Not much going on. And when we look at the control map, actually, what's interesting is despite this robust area where you could see 2 or 3 days ago, Russia sort of pushed its forces up to the line of control, the only change has actually been here. This is, again, sort of a tiny little fraction of a push into Hyrinkivka. And is this part of some, again, larger offensive effort in Luhansk? It seems, again, unlikely, but possible, right? It could be Russian forces are allocated, let's say, here, going to try to push south somehow. It's not impossible. But again, I really think the best data that we have indicates a Luhansk offensive. Russia's not going to do anything quickly. I really think the symbolic value of Kremino the Lyman is going to be important enough for Russia that that's where they're going to want to make their troops push. Despite the obvious risks in the terrain, as we've talked about, this is just a little canal that I'm sure Ukrainian forces are planning on turning into a shooting gallery. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had for you. War Mapper, you can see no real updates, says the same thing we talked about. That's all I had for you. Thanks so much. Of course, if you guys want the uncensored combat video breakdowns, this includes, of course, this week's was looking at the Sivdiv video, the helmet cam of his team taking on the Russian Spetsnaz. It's wild footage, but if you want that, the link is in the description. Thanks, as always, to my Colonel and Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. I appreciate you so much, especially Thomas McLeod and Robin Colburn are Colonel tier patrons. All right. See you guys in the next one.